What happens when two philosophical giants face off about the most fundamental human experience? One says escape your suffering, the other says embrace it. Buddha, life is suffering. Nietzsche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Who's right? And more importantly, whose advice will actually change your life? Two philosophers, two radically different approaches to human suffering. But which one actually works? Let's find out. Hey everyone, Matt here from Buddha's Wisdom, and today we're doing something a little different. We're putting two of history's most influential thinkers into a philosophical face-off to see whose approach to suffering actually works better. In the east corner, we have Siddhartha Gautama, better known as the Buddha. If you watched our video about his life, you already know his incredible journey from privileged prince to enlightened teacher. This guy figured out how to overcome suffering around 2,500 years ago, and people are still following his advice today. And in the west corner, weighing in with probably the most impressive mustache in philosophical history, we have Friedrich Nietzsche. The German philosopher who told us God is dead, questioned everything about society, and believed suffering wasn't just inevitable. It was actually valuable. These two never met. They lived about 2,400 years apart, but they both tackled the same massive question. Why do we suffer, and what should we do about it? Now I know what you're thinking. This might sound heavy, but these two brilliant minds developed strategies that millions of people still use today to find meaning, purpose, and yes, even happiness. Whether you're dealing with a breakup, struggling with work stress, or just feeling lost, Buddha and Nietzsche have surprisingly practical advice that could completely change your perspective. So get comfortable and prepare to have your mind expanded as we explore two radically different approaches to life's biggest challenge. Let's get to know our philosophical heavyweights before we jump into their ideas about suffering. First up, Buddha. Born Siddhartha Gautama, around 563 BCE in what's now Nepal. This guy had everything: wealth, luxury, a gorgeous palace. His father was so determined to protect him from suffering that he built walls to keep the real world out. But one day, Siddhartha snuck out and saw four sights that changed everything: an old man, a sick person, a dead body, and a wandering holy man. For the first time, he realized suffering was inevitable for everyone, including himself. So at 29, he walked away from his palace, wealth, and even his family to find answers. After 6 years of extreme spiritual practices that led nowhere, he discovered the middle way. Sitting under the Bodhi tree, he reached enlightenment and spent the next 45 years teaching others how to end suffering. His solution: suffering comes from desire and attachment, so the path to freedom is learning to let go. Now fast forward about 2,400 years to meet Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844 in Prussia. Unlike Buddha, Nietzsche didn't start with luxury. His father died when he was just 4, and by 24, he became the youngest professor ever at the University of Basel. But his life was filled with suffering. Debilitating health problems, a disastrous love life, and he lived during a time when traditional values were crumbling. Science challenged religion, industrialization transformed society, and people questioned everything. In this chaos, Nietzsche didn't seek escape from suffering. Instead, he developed a philosophy that embraced life's hardships as necessary for growth. What does not kill me makes me stronger. That's Nietzsche. You've heard this everywhere, from Conan the Barbarian's grim determination to Joker's chaos philosophy in The Dark Knight. Kelly Clarkson turned it into a pop anthem, and Kanye West sampled it. But before it became the ultimate comeback line, it was Nietzsche's deeply personal philosophy for facing life's challenges. So here we have two thinkers shaped by completely different worlds. Buddha, born into luxury, chose to confront suffering by abandoning comfort. Nietzsche, plagued by illness and rejection, transformed his personal struggles into a philosophy celebrating life's difficulties. As we explore their ideas, Remember, these weren't just abstract theories, but hard-won insights from lives defined by the search for meaning amid suffering. So which approach makes more sense for your life? Now that we know who Buddha was, let's dive into his revolutionary ideas about suffering that have helped millions find peace for over 2 millennia. If you've watched our video about samsara, you already know that Buddha saw suffering as part of a larger cycle. But what exactly did he mean by suffering? In Pali, the language of Buddha's teachings, the word is dukkha. Dukkha is tricky to translate precisely. It's not just pain or sadness, it's more like a persistent dissatisfaction that follows us around. Think about getting something you've wanted for ages. Maybe the latest phone, a job promotion, or a date with your crush. You feel amazing for a while. Then that happiness fades, and you're back to wanting something else. Buddha noticed this pattern and said, "Whoa, wait a minute. This never ends." Even when things are good, there's this underlying sense that something's off or missing. This understanding became the first noble truth. Life contains inevitable suffering. But Buddha didn't stop there. He dug deeper to find the cause, which brings us to the second noble truth. Suffering comes from craving and attachment. Think about your favorite food. Wanting it isn't the problem. The suffering comes when you cling to the experience, when you can't enjoy your meal because you're already sad it's almost over, or when you're comparing it to a better version you had before. We do this with everything: relationships, achievements, even our own identities. As we explored in our video about love and attachment, Buddha distinguished between healthy desire and the clinging that causes suffering. You can love deeply without the desperate grasping that turns love into a source of pain. Buddha explained that we get caught in samsara, that endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth we talked about in previous videos. We chase pleasure, avoid pain, and cling to our idea of who we are. But everything changes, so this approach guarantees suffering. The alternative? Nirvana. Not the 90s grunge band, but a state where you're free from the endless wanting. It's not about feeling nothing. It's about not being controlled by your cravings and aversions. Let me make this super practical. Imagine you're scrolling through social media, seeing all those perfect lives. You feel inadequate and want what others have. That's dukkha in action. The Buddha would say your suffering comes not from lacking what they have, but from the craving itself. The solution isn't getting more followers or a fancier vacation to post about. It's recognizing that the cycle of comparison and craving never ends. There's always someone with more likes, more adventures, more apparent happiness. Buddha's approach is radical. Train your mind to observe these cravings without being ruled by them. This doesn't mean becoming some emotionless robot. It means experiencing life's pleasures without desperate attachment, and facing difficulties without being crushed by them. When you understand impermanence, that everything changes, you can enjoy good times without desperately clutching them, and you can endure tough times knowing they'll pass too. This insight led Buddha to develop the Eightfold Path, practical steps like ethical behavior, mindfulness, and meditation that help break the cycle of suffering. These aren't just spiritual practices, they're practical tools for living with greater ease. For Buddha, suffering isn't something heroic to power through. It's an unnecessary burden we can learn to put down. And the reward isn't just feeling better. It's freedom from the endless cycle of craving that keeps us trapped. For Buddha, freedom comes when we stop clinging to what we can't control. Nietzsche, however, saw suffering through an entirely different lens. While Buddha was all about letting go of attachments to end suffering, Nietzsche took a completely different approach. If Buddha's philosophy was let it go, Nietzsche's was more like bring it on. Nietzsche identified two fundamentally different ways people face suffering. The first is what he called reactive, when we experience pain and immediately try to blame someone or something. It's not fair. Why me? It's their fault. Sound familiar? Nietzsche called this ressentiment. French pronunciation bonus points if you can nail it. And he saw it as a weak response that keeps people stuck. The second approach is active, accepting suffering as part of life and using it as fuel for growth. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the active person asks, "What can I become through this?" This is where Nietzsche's famous quote comes from: "What does not kill me makes me stronger." At the core of Nietzsche's philosophy is something he called the will to power. Now, this isn't about dominating others or becoming some muscle-bound dictator. It's more subtle and profound. The will to power is about self-mastery and growth. It's the drive to overcome obstacles, including your own limitations. Think of it like this. When you push through intense exercise even though your muscles are burning, you're expressing will to power. When you face a fear instead of avoiding it, that's will to power. When you create something meaningful despite criticism, that's will to power too. For Nietzsche, suffering isn't just inevitable. It's necessary for becoming who you truly are. He wrote, "The discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you not know that it is this discipline alone that has created all enhancements of man so far?" Let's make this concrete. Imagine you're going through a painful breakup. The Buddha might advise you to recognize your attachment to the relationship and gradually let go of the craving for what was. Nietzsche would say, "Use this pain. Let it reveal your dependencies, challenge your assumptions about love, and forge you into someone stronger and more authentic." Nietzsche even developed a concept called amor fati, the love of fate. This isn't just accepting whatever happens to you, it's actively embracing it. Imagine getting fired, and instead of thinking, "This sucks," you think, "This is exactly what needed to happen for my growth." That's some next-level mental reframing. One of my favorite Nietzsche quotes captures this mindset perfectly. "I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful." In other words, don't just accept the obstacles in your path. Appreciate them as the very things that make your journey meaningful. While Buddha sought a path out of suffering through detachment, Nietzsche saw suffering as the resistance that builds our spiritual muscles. Without it, we remain weak, comfortable, and, in his view, less than fully alive. Nietzsche didn't just develop his ideas in isolation. He directly challenged Buddha's approach with criticisms that reveal the heart of their philosophical conflict. While Buddha and Nietzsche never met, Nietzsche definitely knew about Buddhism. And guess what? He was not a fan. In fact, he launched some serious criticisms against Buddha's approach to suffering that reveal the heart of their philosophical disagreement. Nietzsche called Buddhism a nihilistic philosophy. Strong words that need context. While he actually admired Buddhism for being more realistic and psychologically sophisticated than Christianity, he misunderstood Buddha's nirvana as a form of nothingness or escape. For Nietzsche, this path away from suffering looked suspiciously like giving up on life's vitality. In his book, The Antichrist, Nietzsche wrote that Buddhism represents the struggle against suffering, nothing but that. He saw Buddha's approach as essentially saying, "Life is suffering, so let's find a way to stop participating in it so deeply." To Nietzsche, this was a form of surrender, a retreat from life rather than a full embrace of it. Nietzsche's harshest criticism was that Buddhism represented what he called life denial. In his view, Buddha's teachings encouraged people to withdraw from the intensity of existence, its pleasures as well as its pains, in favor of a calm detachment. For someone who believed in saying yes to life in all its messy glory, this seemed like a philosophy of no. The core disagreement comes down to this: should suffering be transcended or transformed? Buddha taught that suffering stems from our attachments and cravings. The solution is to recognize these patterns and gradually free ourselves from them. The ultimate goal, nirvana, is liberation from the cycle of suffering. Nietzsche, on the other hand, saw suffering as essential to human growth. Without resistance, there's no strength. Without challenges, no triumph. Removing suffering would mean removing the very conditions that allow for greatness. Let's break this down with an example. Imagine you're an artist facing rejection. Buddha might advise you to examine your attachment to external validation and recognition. Your suffering comes not from the rejection itself, but from your craving for success and fear of failure. As you let go of these attachments, the rejection loses its sting. Nietzsche would take a completely different approach. He'd say, use this rejection. Let it fuel your determination. Create even more boldly in defiance of those who dismissed you. The suffering itself can be transformed into the energy that drives your greatest work. One approach seeks to transcend suffering by detaching from the causes. The other seeks to transform suffering into the raw material for growth and creation. This reveals another key distinction: active versus passive approaches to life's challenges. Nietzsche characterized Buddha's path as fundamentally passive, a way of accepting what is and detaching from desire. In contrast, his own philosophy was radically active, imposing your will upon circumstances and creating meaning through struggle. It's like the difference between weathering a storm by finding shelter versus learning to dance in the rain. Both approaches deal with the storm, but in fundamentally different ways. So who's right? Is suffering something to overcome through detachment, as Buddha taught? Or is it the essential resistance that builds our character, as Nietzsche believed? The answer might not be as clear-cut as either philosopher would have us believe. In fact, despite their profound disagreement, Buddha and Nietzsche shared some surprising common ground. And that's what we'll explore next. You might think Buddha and Nietzsche are philosophical opposites after everything we've covered. One says escape suffering, the other says embrace it. But dig deeper, and you'll find these great thinkers share some surprising similarities. First, both were radical truth seekers who challenged the status quo. Buddha rejected the rigid caste system and extreme asceticism of his time. He questioned religious dogma and encouraged followers to test his teachings rather than accept them blindly. Don't believe anything simply because you've heard it, he taught. Similarly, Nietzsche took a sledgehammer to conventional morality and traditional religion. His famous declaration that God is dead wasn't celebrating atheism as much as recognizing that modern society had moved beyond simply accepting religious authority. Both men refused to accept the conventional wisdom of their times and forged their own paths. Second, Buddha and Nietzsche both targeted illusion as the enemy. Buddha's concept of Maya refers to the illusions that cloud our perception and keep us trapped in suffering. His entire practice aims to see through these illusions to perceive reality as it truly is. Nietzsche was equally concerned with how humans deceive themselves. He criticized the herd mentality that makes people blindly follow social norms. He challenged people to question inherited values and create authentic ones. Both philosophers were essentially saying, wake up. You're living in a dream constructed by society and your own mind. Perhaps most surprisingly, Buddha and Nietzsche shared fascinating insights about the self. Buddha taught anatta, or no self, the idea that what we call our self isn't a fixed, permanent entity, but a collection of constantly changing processes. When we cling to a rigid identity, we create suffering. Nietzsche approached this from a different angle, but reached a similar conclusion. He wrote that there is no being behind doing, affecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. He saw the self as something fluid and created through action, not a fixed essence. Both thinkers recognize that clinging to rigid ideas about who we are limits our potential and creates unnecessary suffering. Freedom comes from recognizing that we aren't fixed entities, but dynamic processes capable of transformation. Even their views on desire share common ground. While Buddha advocated detachment from craving, he didn't promote emotionless existence. The goal was freedom from being controlled by desires, not freedom from having them. Nietzsche, despite celebrating passion and intensity, also warned against being enslaved by one's impulses. Both valued self-mastery and freedom from compulsion. If Buddha and Nietzsche sat down for coffee, they might agree that most people live unconsciously, trapped in illusions. Freedom requires seeing through social conditioning. The self is not what most people think it is. Truth matters more than comfort. Suffering has meaning and purpose, though they debate what that purpose is. Their approaches to suffering might look like opposites on the surface, but both offer paths to freedom and authenticity. Both challenge us to wake up from sleepwalking through life and take responsibility for our experience. These surprisingly similar thinkers offer complementary tools, not competing philosophies. The wisdom lies in knowing which approach to use when life challenges you, and that's the practical guide we're about to build. So we've explored Buddha's path of transcending suffering through detachment and Nietzsche's approach of transforming suffering into strength. Now comes the practical part. How do you actually use these philosophies in your daily life? The truth is, neither approach works perfectly for every situation. Sometimes detachment is exactly what you need. Other times, you need to lean into the struggle and let it strengthen you. The wisdom comes in knowing which approach to use when. Let's break this down into a practical guide. When to use Buddha's approach. When facing situations you truly can't change. When dealing with minor annoyances that don't matter in the big picture. When your own expectations are causing unnecessary suffering. When attachments to outcomes are clouding your judgment. When ruminating on past events that can't be undone. For example, you're stuck in traffic and getting frustrated. The Buddha would suggest observing your frustration without feeding it. Notice how your body feels, how your thoughts spiral, and then let it go. The traffic won't move faster because you're angry, so why suffer? When to use Nietzsche's approach. When facing challenges that will help you grow. When pursuing meaningful goals despite difficulties. When standing up for your values requires strength. When creativity requires pushing through resistance. When building resilience is more important than immediate comfort. Say you're training for a marathon, mile 18 hits and your legs feel like concrete. Every instinct screams to stop. Buddha might tell you, detach from the pain. Observe it without resistance. Let go of suffering. Nietzsche, he'd say, lean into the burn, because that agony is what makes you unbreakable. The most powerful approach combines both philosophies. Start by using Buddha's mindfulness to clearly see your situation without being clouded by reactivity. Ask yourself, is this suffering serving a purpose? Is it helping me grow towards something meaningful? If not, practice detachment. If yes, channel your inner Nietzsche and use that suffering as fuel. Here's a simple exercise you can try right now. Think of something that's causing you suffering. First, take the Buddha approach. Observe it with detachment, recognizing any attachments or cravings involved. Then take Nietzsche's view. Ask how this challenge might be necessary for your growth or what strength it might be building in you. Science actually supports this flexible approach. Research on resilience shows that both acceptance and active coping strategies are essential for mental health. Psychologists have found mindfulness, Buddha's territory, reduces stress and improves well-being. While post-traumatic growth studies, Nietzsche's wheelhouse, show that facing adversity often leads to positive personal transformation. The Buddha-Nietzsche hybrid approach gives you a complete toolkit, the calm clarity to accept what can't be changed, and the fierce determination to transform what can. Remember that both philosophers wanted the same thing for humanity: freedom. Buddha sought freedom from the tyranny of craving and attachment. Nietzsche sought freedom from societal constraints and self-deception. Both wanted humans to live more authentic, meaningful lives. Your path to freedom lies not in rigidly following either philosophy, but in having the wisdom to know when to let go and when to push through. That's not just philosophical theory. It's practical wisdom for living well in a complex world. We've taken quite the journey with these two philosophical giants. exploring radically different approaches to one of life's most universal experiences: suffering. Buddha showed us that much of our suffering comes from attachment and craving. By practicing mindfulness and gradually loosening our grip on desires, we can find freedom from the endless cycle of wanting. His path offers peace, clarity, and release from unnecessary mental struggle. Nietzsche reminded us that struggle itself can forge us into stronger, more authentic versions of ourselves. By embracing life's challenges and transforming suffering into growth, we can create meaning, even in difficulty. His approach offers strength, purpose, and the exhilaration of overcoming. The real power comes not from choosing one philosophy over the other, but from developing the wisdom to know which approach serves us best in different situations. Sometimes, letting go is the answer. Other times, pushing through is exactly what we need. What both philosophers agreed on is perhaps most important. Most people live unconsciously, trapped in illusions and societal conditioning. True freedom starts with waking up, questioning assumptions, and taking responsibility for your experience. Whether you lean more toward Buddha's peaceful detachment or Nietzsche's passionate engagement, the key is moving through life with greater awareness. Stop being pushed around by cravings you don't understand or conforming to ideals you've never questioned. What's your experience with these different approaches to suffering? Have you found one works better than the other in certain situations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. So here's my challenge for you. The next time you face suffering, pause. Ask yourself, should I let go of my attachment to how things should be? Or should I use this resistance to build something meaningful? The simple moment of reflection puts you on the path both philosophers valued, the path of conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. If you've enjoyed this philosophical face-off, hit that subscribe button and check out our other videos exploring Buddha's wisdom for modern life. Next time life punches you in the gut, ask yourself, should I let go or fight through? The answer might just change everything.